the fourth series of Camden Talks. It's an amazing conversation we're happening with Alan Rusbridger and Janine Gibson, both former editors of The Guardian. Janine, of course, was based in the US and Alan based in the UK.
Great honor to have Alan and Janine joining us, two giants in the field of journalism and also two locals who live in our community, and further validates my crazy decision to move to Queen's Crescent. So we have Alan here. I'm going to introduce Alan and Janine, and then we're going to talk about their careers and also what happened with the Snowden case. We have Alan here, who was, as you may know, was the editor-in-chief of The Guardian for many years. His work has won many awards, including an Emmy and a Pulitzer Prize for public services. Major stories have been included the phone hacking story, disclosures about illegal torture, tax avoidance, and what we're here to talk about this evening, the Snowden case. Alan is now editor of The Prospect magazine, which is one of Britain's leading current affairs magazine. And then we have Janine here also, Janine Gibson, who is editor of The Weekend FT. She was previously editor of The Guardian in New York City, The Guardian US branch. And she was also briefly UK editor-chief at BuzzFeed UK. And also Janine's work has won multiple awards, including the Pulitzer for the Snowden case and NSA surveillance. So I'm going to take us back. We're here to talk about the time you guys broke this story. So I read that, Janine, you called up Alan and you said, I have a little story for you.
That is
right?
true.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to take us back to that moment and hear about what did you hear? What were you thinking at the time? What did you tell Alan? And what did you guys do from there?
Well, I had somewhat rashly hired a man named Glenn Greenwald to be a columnist for Guardian US because we were starting up and we needed some attention and we needed to build an audience. And Glenn, who you may or may not have come across, but he's a sort of notorious firebrand who writes extensively, if you've ever had to cut him, on the topic of surveillance, privacy, civil liberties. His takes are always contentious, and he had a significant fan base. Anyway, he joined Guardian US, and we bubbled merrily along with many culture clashes about what we considered reporting and editing and so on. But he was doing the job. He was sort of attracting a lot of attention for the things he was writing in a devoted fan base. And then, but he lived in Rio de Janeiro. This is an important point because he rang me up one day on his Skype phone, which was the only way he could communicate, which he liked to do as little as possible. And he said, I've got a story. I've got the biggest story that's ever happened. I've got the biggest security leak in a generation, if not ever. I've got the biggest surveillance and security leak. It's bigger than water, it's bigger than anything. And I already thought, yeah, all right. And we had I'm going to go back slightly, sorry. It's a long time since I've told this, can you remember? We had worked on WikiLeaks, the leak of the WikiLeaks cable some years before. I had been quite peripheral to that, but I'd been around and I'd done some of the digital stuff, and I'd heard a lot of the security measures that we were taking around WikiLeaks. And the first thing I thought when he said this was, Skype is like the least secure thing in the world. Skype is as leaky as just anybody can listen to Skype. You can do it with a tin can, listen to somebody's Skype call. I was like, are you calling me from home? He said, yes. Like, and as he started to tell me that he'd got these leaked documents, I just thought the best thing I could do is cut him off and get him into New York. So I just get on a plane, come to New York. And I think, was it then I called you or was it after I'd seen him? I think I called you after I'd seen him because I didn't want you to laugh at me. So he came to New York and he had this thumb drive and we had to go and get an air-gapped computer, i.e. a computer that had never been on the internet. Harry David Blishen taught me that, from Best Buy, and get really, really cheap laptop, which was about £100 in weight and £100 in cash, and sat there on this terrible IKEA sofa in my little office, the three of us, my Deputy Stuart and Glenn and me, as he opened up this PowerPoint presentation that, and I don't know if you can remember what the slides looked like from the first Prism thing, but it was like a 5-year-old had done it. There's just like a big pink triangle and it goes collect all data. Okay. It did not look super pro, and it didn't look necessarily, but as we scrolled through it, I thought, it's either the Hitler diaries or it is indeed the biggest, and that is when I thought I'd better. I mean, obviously we have an awful lot of independence and autonomy, and he trusts me implicitly, but I probably should mention this. And just called him up and said, I've got a little story to talk to you about. Can you remember the rest of that conversation?
Well, I think what happened then was you said to me, this guy, whoever he is in Hong Kong, and we had to go and meet him in Hong Kong.
We had all these theories that he would be, if this is real, because that's always the first thing was, just for ages, was, is it real or is he just a complete fantasist trying to bring down the Guardian for nefarious reasons? And so we built up this massive picture of him as a late career operative. You know, you can see him in the movie, sort of 60 odd, but probably got, a bit of cancer, feeling really bad about everything he's done with his, sort of Ed Harris, and feeling some regret and thinking that it was time to tell the truth about what he'd done to the nation, which was all very vivid and completely untrue. And
we were slightly scarred by having dealt with Julian Assange.
Right, yes, slightly. Yeah.
Whatever you think of Julian Assange, he's a complicated man, and the relationship hadn't ended well with him. But it was complicated because this, whoever he was in Hong Kong, and the very first decision we had to take was, do we go to Hong Kong to meet him? And we also knew that he had been in touch with the Washington Post, and it subsequently turned out the Washington Post refused to go and meet him in Hong Kong because they thought, this guy's in communist China, this all could be very dodgy. The second decision was, I'd never met Glenn Greenwald. I had your description of him. I'd read his columns. I knew that he lived in Rio with 13 rescue dogs.
That's
I thought
the most normal thing about him.
So there I was thinking, this could well be, and I may even have gone to see a lawyer at that point, who may or may not have said this would breach the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act. To which I said, well, what's the defence to that? And he said, there is no defence. So you were instantly plunged into a sort of legal, quite a tricky legal situation. And I thought, we can't. If this is going to be the biggest story of all time, I can't really trust this to somebody I've never met who lives with 13 rescue dogs in Rio. So I think I said to you at that point,
well, I was going, well, we need to send somebody, and I looked out the door, and it just happened that Ewan McCaskill was sat outside my office. He wasn't normally based in the New York office. He was usually in DC as our US political editor or diplomatic editor or something. But the main thing that Ewan was Alan's go-to guy for something terrible has happened somewhere, and we need to send someone. We've got to apologise to the Chinese, send Ewan.
Ewan McCaskill, very almost monosyllabic Presbyterian Scot.
You always say it's a Presbyterian Scot.
Who had been up around. So the ultimate, if you wanted anybody to kick the tires on a story, Ewan was the guy. The next problem.
Well, Glenn and Laura didn't want him to go with them.
Yeah, so he'd also been in touch with a filmmaker called Laura Poitras, who went on to make an Oscar-winning documentary about the whole thing. So basically, there were the three of them, the mystery man, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald, who were all brilliant in their own ways, but basically hated newspapers, and they didn't trust The Guardian or anybody else. And then we sent this sort of narc in to work with them, and so they instinctively hated Ewan as well.
That was the most important thing at the beginning, before we even got to, is this real?
Yeah.
It was Ewan winning the trust of not even the source, but the intermediaries to the source, who he had reached out to both Glenn and Laura, and this chap from the Washington Post who was Barton, who was very frustrated because his bosses wouldn't send him. because of their standing in their profile, which is why I was talking about Glenn's reach into this world. It was really important that he had that reach, because that's how Snowden found him and knew that he would tell the truth, because he would stand up to the newspapers, he would bully these mealy-mouthed editors or whatever. And Laura was completely independent. So Ewan's job was the charm offensive with those two, and his brilliance is, he is, for someone who's seen every difficult, terrible thing around the world, he retains this purity of heart that sort of shines out of him, and he's so sincere and sceptical, but you know he's giving you a fair shot, and he's really listening. And they very quickly were brilliantly one round of, okay, fine, Ewan can come with us. Obviously, you're paying for the flights. So we sent them to Hong Kong.
And so at what point, though, did both of you meet Snowden, and how did that meet?
Not till afterwards.
Not until afterwards.
No.
Okay. So you had to rely on Ewan to...
Ewan was absolutely the key to the situation. And we had code words, because, I know it sounds ridiculous, but when you're doing these things and you're looking at the slides, they show you the capabilities of the people you're up against, in a sense. It is very filmic, because you're looking and you turn the slide and you go, oh, okay, they've got all of that. And indeed, and all of that. So we had to, Alan had to send me James Ball from London, who was a relatively young journalist who had joined us from WikiLeaks. He'd been working from Julian Assange, was pretty nifty in the old trade craft of how this stuff works. He had to teach us all how to use disposable chat rooms on the internet. There was a period when we could have bought anything on the dark web. We were really on it. We didn't. But we had to have a thing called Tails and another thing. Every communication had to be on a secure computer, go through an incredibly complicated process. And so Ewan basically had agreed with me that if he thought the source was good, and we'd rehearsed 20 ways that he could establish this, from has he got a CIA car park pass,
whether he was a legitimate
then
source.
he would just text me and say the Guinness was good, but not text me through one of these very disposable chat rooms. Because the other thing about Ewan is he does love an Irish pub. So the Guinness is good, we thought, was an unreplicable piece of code to say, yeah, this is good.
And so he went and met him.
Yeah, he went.
And he checked out.
They met him through the medium of a Rubik's Cube, because they were all expecting Ed Harris, and there's this sort of relatively attractive young man, and they just didn't, they would never have in. So they had the secret signal of a Rubik's Cube that he would be holding in this hotel in Hong Kong.
Right.
And then when they met, they had to go to his room, and there were wet towels by the door and phones in the fridge, all sorts of paranoid measures. It was a bit towel over the head, sort of cloak and dagger. But Ewan worked his magic. Laura, I think, also was very, 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 very patient. Glenn was Glenn. But Glenn had a real thirst for the topic. He had the fire and the anger. He was the one that phoned me up 2 weeks later to go, "You've got to publish now, or I'm going to publish it myself."
And Alan, what were you thinking at the time? So you're thinking your U.S. Espionage Act, you could get into trouble. What was the huge dilemma? What were you weighing up when deciding with Janine? What do we actually do?
Chiefly
about
whether
this?
I was going to go to jail or not.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that.
And apart from that, it was. I mean, the pressure was intense, because, I mean, basically you had this guy on the loose, and if you've seen any of those films about guys on the loose, what happens next is there's a giant global manhunt to find the guy on the loose. And Snowden, I think, genuinely thought they would be after him, because he'd said he was going for treatment for epilepsy or something, but he thought that sooner or later they're going to work out that I'm missing and they're going to come looking for me.
Yeah, so he'd been off work for 2 or 3 days, and they'd sent somebody to his house. He lived in Hawaii with his girlfriend. They'd sent somebody to his house to knock on the door. So he was getting very antsy. And he, by the way, had always planned that he was going to reveal his identity. So again, a thing that was, and bear in mind at this stage, we still don't know if it's real or not. And the Washington Post have had 6 months on this, and they haven't run a thing. And we were all of day 3, I think, or day 4 that we sent them to Hong Kong. But he was getting very antsy that he was going to be exposed, and he wanted to reveal himself. He wanted to do the big reveal of the first story, the second story. The first one was about the tapping of phones, massive amounts of phones, and from AT&T and various other US cell phone providers. And the second one was PRISM, which was this enormous collection program. And he wanted to get those 2 out before he revealed himself, because he was very sharp. He knew what happened to whistleblowers. He knew he'd get revealed. He was perfectly prepared for that. But he didn't want to be the story until the story that he wanted to tell had had its impact and had been heard and understood.
Let me just interject. What do you think he wanted to do? What was he driven by, Snowden? Was it some moral compass about the greater good? What was driving him as an individual to uncover this?
Well, it's interesting because at the time we didn't really know, beyond a pretty garbled and very overwritten manifesto that was the kind of thing that a 20-something would write when preparing to blow up their life in order to tell a story complete with an enormous number of adjectives. It was a bit, we were a bit like, we're not running that. Because when you have a source, as Alan said, Alan had gone several rounds with Julian Assange, and the thing is, you have to maintain a line that goes, you're our source, and we have lots of duty of care to you, but we don't have to write the story the way you want it written. We both the burden of proof of making sure it's true, but also your cause is not our cause, and we need to be careful not to adopt that. In the same way, he never asked us to adopt his security. That would have put us, I think, in a much more difficult position. But that's a source, and you're the journalist, and you're the editor, and you decide what you publish. So they're in Hong Kong. We don't know if it's true or not. We've got people that know what they're talking about reading these documents. Spencer Ackerman had done a huge amount of national security reporting in the US, and he'd heard tell of some of these programs. He'd had whispers. He was so excited he had to go to the gym every morning and do 35 pull-ups just to get himself into the office in a steady state. Everybody was very excited, but we had no idea until we had a lawyer, didn't we, who'd pre-pub lawyer, but in America it's very difficult because essentially you've got a right to publish. Yeah. A UK lawyer would be going, you can't publish this, you absolutely can't publish. But a US lawyer goes, well, you've got a right to publish. I mean, it doesn't make it true. And he didn't want to do a line read or check everything or go, how do you know this is true or how do you know that is true, which I found rather alarming. But he was very interested in constructing the sort of public interest defence of why we had published it, which was Alan's area of complete expertise. But the moment came, we rang AT&T or Verizon and said we didn't tell them anything about the rest of it, but we said we've got a secret court order, FISA court order. Mandating the collection of huge amounts of telephone records, and instead of saying we have no comment, we know nothing about such thing, we don't know what you're talking about, they said, what's the date on it? And I said to the reporter that made the call, so he's basically going, is it the green one or the yellow one? So at that point, nobody's ever seen a secret FISA court order. You can't Google it and go, what do they look like? But then we're like, okay, this is right. So we rang the White House, which was hilarious, because, well, it wasn't, it was terrifying. But I was doing I suddenly turned into Mary Poppins at this point. I was being very, very British, and they sort of called me straight back, and they had amassed, 5 chiefs of various things. There was the deputy chief of the CIA, the deputy chief of the FBI, the deputy chief of the NSA, the deputy director of national intelligence, and probably about 18 other people as well. Everybody seemed to call Bob. And they were being they were like, we're just trying to understand what you folks have got here. This sounds very, Very interesting. We'd love to have you all over. Come on over to the Oval Office and we'll sit down and we'll have a little chat about it. And because you can't possibly understand the implications of this. And we were like, well, no. We do, but we're bringing.
So you
to
had
give
lawyers
you.
Advising you throughout this process?
Yes, but there was a bit of it that was just a bit more Guardian than the lawyers, wasn't it? I mean, I can't tell you how much of an advantage it had been knowing that Alan had been on to Hillary Clinton 2 years before about the WikiLeaks cables and thinking, the Guardian has done this before.
Yeah.
And they tried to tell me off about journalism, or this is no kind of journalism, and I did go very Mary Poppins, and I was like, well, you may talk to me about national security, but I think I'll be the judge of the... I look back and think, from where did I get the nerve? But I didn't
So then what finally allowed you to press the trigger?
Alan said, I'm sure it's all fine. I'm going to get on the plane. You make the decision.
Well, I mean, inside that hotel room, there was this sort of boiling pressure with the three of them. And they were basically all in league saying, if you don't publish this, we can see you're going to chicken out. We knew
Just
this
like
was
the
going to
Washington
happen.
Post.
You're gutless. If you don't publish it by tonight, then we'll take it away and we're going to publish it ourselves. And there's a wonderful bit on the film, the Laura Poitras' film, where Glenn and Snowden are sort of desperate to talk about the significance of all these programs. And Ewan's there with his notebook and he says, excuse me, he says, can you just tell me what your name is? It says Ed Snowden, so that's Snowden. And can I see your CIA garb? So he was still, you're really rushing this. This could go horribly wrong. And the other three were saying, if you don't publish this by tonight, which was that was a hairy pressure. Anyway, I jumped on a plane, and while I was somewhere over Greenland, you said, publish.
I did, and almost immediately, the street outside our office, 25 cones went down in a Verizon van, and people started digging up the street outside our office. And then when we got home that evening, the same thing was going on outside our house. And phones started to make weirdy clicking noises when you pick them up. And I went through 42 phones that year. It turns out that, in the wire where they all have disposable phones, and that's useless. That is an absolute piece of fiction. And I'm not just saying this because David Simon poured cold water on our story, which he did because he didn't like other people having things. But that is absolutely useless because you stand like a sore thumb in the middle of Manhattan or Brooklyn or London with your burner phone, and you're the easiest thing in the world to spot. So burner phones are no good at all. Just a tip if you're moving into...
Alan, from what I understand, the UK asked you to destroy the hard drives of information. Is that right?
So we're jumping ahead a bit, but so Edward Snowden then reveals himself.
Right.
We get the material back to London thanks to somebody who probably would rather not be named, who's sitting in the audience here, Dave.
There were many routes back to London, all of which were completely illegal, and nobody knows who was carrying what at any given time, including the people that were carrying it.
And in time, I thought, why has nobody from British security been in touch with me?
Okay.
And then we published a story about British security, and David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister, sent Sir Jeremy Hayward, who was his permanent secretary, round to have a very civilised cup of tea. And first of all, there was a little plastic glass of water between us. And Jeremy Hayward began by saying, in that block of flats over the road, he said, the Chinese will be there now. I said, what do you mean the Chinese will be there? He said, the Chinese spies will be in that building now. And by the way, your glass of water is a microphone. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, the Chinese will be there, and they will have a laser beam on your glass, which will turn it into a microphone because they'll measure the vibrations on top. So that was obviously to completely spook us out. And then he said, you've had your fun, and now you must stop. And I fear I gave him a rather pompous reply about, I don't think it's for the British government to tell me what I can publish. We're still reading these documents and we'll be very careful about them, but I think it's for me to decide, not for you to decide. And that lasted for about a week. And then he came back and said, no, it has to stop. And if it doesn't stop, we'll stop you. So I said, how? He said, I'm not going to tell you, but we will stop you.
And stop you meaning stop you from publishing? Stop the stories coming out on the issue.
Yeah. But his next obsession was how securely we were keeping these documents, because if it was true that the Chinese were in the block of flats opposite, so they sent round some goons from GCHQ to inspect the security. We pulled the blinds down by then, so that
there were actually very good security measures.
We had very good security measures. And their next obsession, which I've never fully understood, was that they wanted us to destroy all our computers that we were holding up. And at that point I said, well, I should tell you that I have shared everything we have with the New York Times, because I had. Because I thought this moment will come, the British state will come through the front door at some point and they will stop us, and so at that point I will have to go and edit out of America, because in America they wouldn't stop you. So
was the US more open?
But when Jeremy Hayward turned up in Alan's office, we were publishing stories.
Yeah.
We'd probably done 10 stories by this point. I was having daily chats with my pals Bob, and Bob, which had got reasonably affable because there wasn't much they could do. So I would just phone them up every day and go, so we're looking at a document, it's called this. We're looking to publish material from page 15 to 17. Can you give me the specific security requirements that would suggest? So they had an opportunity with everything to say, please can you redact that? This is the reason why that. And we listened to everything and weighed it as to whether we thought there was a specific threat to individuals or operations or so on. But it's all data collection. I mean, we weren't casual about it, but we gave them. So we were having reasonably good-natured. Is that the one with the? He was back at. Is that the one with the yellow triangle? Yeah, that's the one with the. And they had never once suggested shutting us down because they can't, because of the First Amendment.
Well, not just the First Amendment, but the Pentagon Papers, which was the great case in the 1970s when the New York Times and the Washington Post both published all the true history of the Vietnam War, and Nixon tried to stop them. And the Supreme Court absolutely said, we can't have prior restraint. We can't have people stopping you in advance from publishing, which is exactly what Jeremy Hayward was doing, because in Britain we don't have any prohibition on prior restraint. So so I said, look, I should tell you, I'll be totally honest, it's in New York, and if you close me down here, I'll go and publish from New York. Yeah. And he said, well, thank you very much, but we will close you down here. And I sometimes see this replayed on Twitter as Alan Rusbridger, the gutless editor who destroyed his computers at the behest of the British state. But actually, it was if I hadn't said yes to that, they would have either arrested me, they would have impounded all material, and Glenn Greenwald would have been free to publish all of them. So this bizarre thing happened, and Sheila over there was in the basement of the Guardian at the time when the GCHQ goons came in, and we thought rather naively, you smash it up with a hammer, or you put super glue in the ports. But it took how many hours to destroy these computers? 5 hours. And they would say that motherboard there, you have to get a drill, and this bit has to be sawn in half, and that bit has to be degouged. Anyway, it was a tremendously. So at the end of it, they had destroyed all the stuff that we worked on. I then wrote about that the following week, which I think they weren't expecting. I think they thought this was a sort of under the radar thing. But after that, they seemed happy. And I'm not happy that we were publishing. and they never gave us any trouble in New York, did they? And I thought
I
they would,
always thought
if they
it
were
was a piece
if they
of
were
theatre.
so worried about the security, they would come and inspect how we were holding the material in New York, and they never
So you
did.
thought it was
I really thought it was theatre. There was a chap called, do you remember the Brigadier, who was part of the D-Notice Committee?
He was a Winco, wasn't he?
In my head he was a brigadier, and I always had this picture of him sort of in a delightful cottage somewhere in the Cotswolds with his wife putting something on the Arga bubbling away and opening a bottle of red, because I would always have to call him in the evening and I'd say, just a heads up, Brigadier, this is a Winco, this is what we're doing. He'd go, oh dear, this is another one, Janine. I'd go, I'm afraid it is, Brigadier. And he used to say to me things like, because we were publishing with the New York Times at this point for obvious protection, but he used to say weird things like, would it be terribly inconvenient if you just let the New York Times go first, just by a few minutes? And I would say, well, yes, rather, it would, because that would make it their story, and we're doing this together. So, that's very disappointing. It would make the most tremendous difference here. And I just thought he was being a bit silly about the internet, but obviously
huge difference between London and New York.
Yeah.
But there was Janine talking to Bob and Bob,
Bob.
who would say, well, let's just get the document, and we've probably got the case officer who works on this, and which pages do you want to publish? Would you mind not publishing page 7, or there's a name on page 9, we'd rather you didn't. In Britain, they still have this ludicrous policy of NCND, neither confirm nor deny. So you ring them up, GCHQ or MI5 or MI6, and you say, we've got this document. And they say, well, we can neither confirm nor deny that document exists. And you say, well, I have it in front of me. I'm sorry, we can neither confirm nor deny. And anyway, we do ring the Winco in the Cotswolds, because the D-Notice system is the system by which there's supposed to be a system of self-censorship. So you ring up Winco and describe the document to Winco, and Winco then rings up somebody, and generally Winco came back and said, my job is to say, is to stop you causing harm, but I can't see that this is going to cause harm. And in the end, we had Winco into a morning conference, and he was very nice about it all.
Oh, I never got to meet him. I think I was still in New York. I felt sad about it.
So, given these two environments, so the UK and the US, I mean, let's say Snowden were to come to you, a Snowden were to come to you today with the same type of documents. What would each of you do differently? And do you think the current journalism climate and the current political climate has changed?
Well, the legal climate has changed. So as a result of these stories, first in Australia and then in the UK, they changed the law so that anybody who did what I did would go to prison for 14 years or up to 14 years. And we tried to get a public interest defence in, so you could say, well, this is why this was the public interest that we thought that was being served. And they refused to allow any public interest defence. So they've tried to make it impossible for anybody either to be a whistleblower or to publish in the way that we did. And I think it's really short-sighted. I mean, I tried to explain this to Hayward and some of the spooks when we met them, that in a way they were really lucky that Glenn Greenwald was working for The Guardian, because he didn't need The Guardian. He could have published that all on his own from his house in Rio with his 13 rescue dogs, and nobody could have had any influence over him at all. He could have published absolutely anything from any of those documents. And it was greatly to the advantage that we were there and working with him and talking to the White House and to the British authorities, which meant that I think we published incredibly safely. And so to have this I think really old-fashioned where we're not going to talk to you and we're not going to confirm or going to deny, and by the way you'll go to jail, is just opening the door for people who are, I mean, not necessarily role players, but next time if the next Snowden wouldn't come to The Guardian or The New York Times.
it's hard to imagine the amount of information we had. Huge swathes. There was a big. He just downloaded everything, or a very substantial chunk of stuff, and especially from GCHQ, he was actually a bit more partial about the NSA stuff. And then he trusted the journalists because he had a huge reverence for journalism and a huge respect for the professional skill, which you might argue was unjustified, but he was lucky that the people took it very seriously. We didn't do any phishing exercises, we didn't publish any raw signal intelligence, and there was raw signal intelligence in there. We did not just go randomly searching for stuff. We confined ourselves to these stories about data collection, surveillance, and so on. And Glenn, these stories are always a battle with lots of fronts, with the government, often with the source, or with the reporters, or the lawyers, or whatever. And Glenn was constantly suggesting it would be better to just put the whole lot on the internet. There were other, even more radical journalists. Laura's quite radical, moderately radical, I was going to say, quite radical. But there were other figures connected with the sort of WikiLeaks world and the understanding, having the deep technical knowledge to understand these documents, who were pushing very hard that everything should be out there and a total disclosure policy, and that had to be sort of resisted and restrained. Every single thing we published, everybody knew about, had been put to them for their serious security concerns and framed within a story. But that wouldn't happen now. You know that. There are a million places we can think of on the internet where somebody would just dump the whole lot.
Yeah. And looking back at the story now, what kind of long-lasting impact do you think it's had? I mean, you've mentioned there's been a change in legislation, but what this kind of story have an impact now?
The first thing that happened was the spooks had for a long time been trying to. There was something called the Snoopers Charter that they were trying to get through, and I think they knew that they were vulnerable because a lot of this that they were actually doing was designed for the age of, the laws were designed for an age of copper clips and copper cables and crocodile clips. And they had sort of bent it, and they knew that one day this was going to be exposed. So the first thing they did was to put it all on a legal footing, which is fine. If Parliament wants to vote to say that we can take all these powers and we can put everybody under a form of surveillance, then it's difficult to argue with that. Although one might query whether there's any meaningful oversight of that. So that was the first thing that happened. But a number of courts did come out subsequently around the world and confirm what Snowden had been saying, and saying that this was illegal. And I think the chief effect was on everybody's sense of their own privacy and how susceptible these devices are. And the big tech companies who featured in these slides was always slightly ambiguous as to whether the spooks had gone in to sort of help themselves, or to the extent that they were complicit in helping themselves. But there was, I took a picture of this today. Nick Clegg has just written a book. Nick Clegg was Deputy Prime Minister at the time.
And then went to Meta.
He went to Meta later, but he was Deputy Prime Minister at the time we were publishing all this stuff. And in this book, which came out last week, I practically fell off my chair because he was talking about how suspicious he was of all this Snoopers Charter stuff. And then he said in this book, I'm just going to find the bit. One thing that was painfully obvious to me, this is the Deputy Prime Minister writing, was that the Home Office and the UK's intelligence services at GCHQ had withheld significant information from me and other democratically elected ministers. We learned far more about their work from reading The Guardian than we ever did from them. So I think there was this sense that all this murky stuff had been going on and keeping the politicians in the dark. So I think that's changed as well.
On a very basic level, I had to put a special key in a air gap computer and form some sort of disposable chat room, which I couldn't anyway, in order to send an encrypted message that was unreadable to other people. And now my kids can do that on their phones using whatever, because the tech companies realised that we thought it was a citizenship question, and it was. Because people didn't know what was being done in their name. But how the tech companies then interpreted it was, this is a bond of trust issue between us and our users. So Apple were particularly upset by the revelations from Prism, because Steve Jobs had made it such a founding principle of the company that it was a sort of walled garden for people, that you could trust them, they weren't selling on your data like all those other fly-by-nights. And now even WhatsApp is trumpeting its end-to-end encryption signal, which a lot of journalists use to protect their sources. None of those things were available, and now there's a bunch of them, because people have understood on some level. They may have given up the fight to block monitoring, but they have understood on an individual level that there are ways in which you can keep your messages secure, or you should definitely try.
Well, I would like to open it up to questions for the next few minutes. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm a sort of hack who's
Sorry, could you speak up? Yeah.
I'm a hack who's written in this area. I just wondered if you could talk about something I've always struggled with. I think you've pretty well got it right, but it's exactly what you decide not to publish and what you decide to publish. So, I mean, a friend of mine, I don't know how he got the information that came from the Snowden stuff, got a D notice and overwrote it, and I was against it. He broke the fact that there was the details of the mass surveillance in the Middle East. Now, it's also mass surveillance, but it could be argued, it's a very grey and difficult thing to make. Do we say mass surveillance of us is a bad thing, but no mass surveillance of something we might be at war with at some point in the future or destabilise the world is actually a worthwhile thing? That's what, after all, the Five Eyes do. Do we break the fact that we spy on our allies? There's so many things. So I just wonder if I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that sort of.
We try to restrict ourselves to mass surveillance of warrantless mass surveillance of citizens. And so we could see stuff that was going on where people were spying on the other spies and were spying on people who were legitimate targets. And we just decided we weren't going to publish any of that because that seemed to us legitimate. So the area we just concentrated on was this business of being able to scoop up all the data of everybody in this room and store it. And the surprising thing I found when I went out and talked about it, I would always begin by, we could try it tonight, I said, is there anybody in the room tonight would be happy if a policeman knocked on their door tonight and said, I just want to collect all your papers, we want to keep them down at the police station, we won't necessarily look at them, but we would just like to keep them there in case we have to look at them. Who's up for that? You say, so how about the state can collect all that information without asking you, and they're going to store it and keep it safe in case they need it, because that's what had happened. And they said it's just metadata. It's not. We don't keep the texts of the messages, but we certainly record who you're in touch with, and what it's about, and where you are, all that metadata. And we did a rather interesting debate, didn't we, with the guy from the NSA, who said once we've got the metadata, we know everything about your lives.
They can tell the metadata, who you're having an affair with, when you're buying the ring, where you were last week, every crime you've committed, what your car is. They know everything about you from the words are irrelevant. It just slows them down. They know everything.
And what had happened over the previous time, there were various bonds of trust that I innocently thought were kind of sacred. So the bond of trust between an MP and a constituent, or a lawyer and their client, or a doctor and their patient, or a priest and their confessant, and a journalist and their source. You know, there's five that you think it's a bond. The state has no business looking to any of those, and at some point the British state, had decided, well, actually, we're not going to respect any of that. So those were the sort of areas that we thought would really shock and upset people if they knew that that was what was going on.
Next, we have one more question here.
You guys kind of talk a lot about the protection that being part of the Guardian provides. How do you feel about being part of the mass media? Do you feel like it protects you? Do you feel like it invalidates your journalism?
Well, my feeling is there are really good people, say, on Substack, who don't want to be part of the mass media and just want to, or wherever they want to do their stuff. I think if they had tried to do this story, they would have been crushed within hours. I mean, Jeremy Haywood himself wouldn't have dignified, but there would have been a goon around there within hours. They would have arrested them, injuncted them, taken everything away. And so what an institution like The Guardian does is to give you an institutional... It's embarrassing to go into The Guardian. And The Guardian has not limitless money, but it has enough money to fight a legal suit. It has enough money to fly me to New York so I can edit from New York. So I think the institutional strength of the media is greatly underestimated, and you could see it leaching away, particularly in the local press. And that just makes people much easier to pick off.
Like Daphne, right?
Like
Panama Papers. So Daphne, reporter who revealed the Panama Papers, didn't have the protection of a big media organisation.
Yeah, do you agree with that?
Well, yes, I do completely, because Theresa May, and Theresa May and Cressida Dick, who sadly are no longer in either of their jobs, tried to prosecute us and really wouldn't stop and wouldn't close the investigation, and were really relentless about it. It was obviously supposed to be a sort of chilling factor that we had this looming over us. And local MP Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, and he stood up and said, we will not be prosecuting journalists for doing their job in the public interest. Which you may have many opinions about Keir Starmer, but I owe him for that one. So I'll never forget that solid.
I should just interrupt and say that this story overlapped with the phone hacking story. So you had a lot of journalists on The Sun and the News of the World who were being investigated by the police. So the tabloid press was by and large not on our side. In fact, the Daily Mail was more or less urging the police to come and arrest me.
There was a wonderful piece in the Evening Standard saying that you should be in prison. I remember that one.
So you had this sort of, well, why are they getting, why is the editor of The Guardian, this is two-tier justice, if you're a humble tabloid journalist. So that attempt by Starmer was to try and draw a distinction between the public interest and tabloid celebrity phone tapping.
But that slightly speaks to my point that I think the way the phrase mainstream media or mass media is understood now isn't that helpful, and I somewhat reject it. I understand what people are trying to say. I'm not trying to be disingenuous, but what we might think of as the mass media is such a broad collection of media operating to entirely different standards. And in very different ways. And I don't see much commonality between, say, the Financial Times, where I work now, and many other publications in this country where 15 years ago, I would think we all understand, we all have a professional code of conduct, we all basically, maybe 20, work the same way. I'm not sure that's still the case, and I think that there's probably journalists on Substack and writing newsletters and doing all sorts of things that have much more in common with the kind of journalism that I would do than other people that you would say are in the mainstream media. I don't think there is a commonality that there used to be.
Back there, yeah, hi.
I spoke to a security data nerd who said that his biggest fear is about kind of smart technology. So he was worried about things like Alexas and, you know, the things that you have in your house that you talk all the time. And he thought that was a big blind spot in people's vision. So how seriously do you take your own personal security now after stories like this?
I do not have Alexa. I do not trust Jeff Bezos to hold on to my private communications. And you should, you know, you can just stand in a really remote corner of your flat and go, Alexa, and just see whether she goes, yes, and guess what she can hear. No, I don't have an Alexa, and I'm still really slightly tinfoil hatty about the settings on my phone. I don't leave it out of the room anymore when I'm having conversations, because that's not necessary. But yeah, I do think people. I'm quite funny about things like plugging your phone into your car or putting on your. I know it's very hard to get rid of a little touch paranoia. I don't think that. There's a lot of ways to pick up a lot of things. There's an enormous number of exploits in WhatsApp alone that when you pay attention and look at what's even been written and what we know about, that your phone can switch on its microphone and listen to everything you're saying remotely. You'll never know. That's just a thing that we know can happen, and most journalists in this country have had their phones tampered with in that way.
Lucy.
Yeah, Jim, we were talking about chilling effects that various entities have. So today Trump has announced he's suing the New York Times for a gazillion dollars. And on one level that's what's funny when he says anything like that, because it's so ridiculous. But this seems now to be a pattern, and is that still firing people up? Is that still firing journalists up to do more, or is this the authoritarianism that we kind of keep doing?
Well, I think it's working, isn't it? I mean, he's new to CBS. He's really hammered ABC. The Washington Post is half the paper that it was, because the Washington Post, I think, was intimidated. You saw all the tech bros paying obeisance to him. He's suing the Pulitzer Prize Committee because they gave a Pulitzer Prize to somebody he disapproved of. He's suing the Wall Street Journal for $10 billion. He's suing the New York Times for $15 billion. And I think that they will all, I hope, although with this Supreme Court you can't be sure, you would hope that the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times will hold firm, though Rupert has now sold the company. I mean, his son Lachlan is now in charge, and Lachlan was the man running Fox News at a point when Fox News decided they didn't want to tell the truth about the 2020 election, and they would rather tell the audience what they wanted to know. So Lachlan, who knowingly published lies about the 2020 election, is now in charge of the Wall Street Journal. So these I'm talking about the institutional strength. You can't take much comfort in those, but it does make you realise how badly we need the New York Times to hold firm, because if the New York Times was to fall, NPR, they've done their best to neuter. And you see how quickly it all falls apart. I mean, one of the things that frustrates me about the Farage government,
Turn around and spit.
the Starmer government, is that, you know, if Farage got in, he would abolish the BBC. I mean, and why is the Starmer government not absolutely setting the BBC in concrete so that it would be very, very difficult to blow up? Because take the BBC out of the information ecosystem in this country, and what have you got left? You know, you've got Lachlan Murdoch, you've got the Daily Mirror is going down the tubes because it's run by Reach, the Telegraph is going to be, it will be run by, it will be owned by who knows who. There's not much left. So it is worrying.
There is a related issue, and today the government has announced that it is going to make it a criminal offence for public servants, that's what they call them, who cover things up. We've seen Horizon, the blood scandal, we've seen, it's going to be called the Hillsborough Law. And what worries me is the ability and the attempts by public servants to hide what they've actually done in wrongdoings. And it's in those cases, and I can give you two local examples here, they actually hide it from the politicians. And I think that is, for me, the most worrying thing. So I'll give you two examples here. A man about 100 yards from here died in his flat and was not discovered for 2 weeks. The council was pressurised to go and visit him and wouldn't or didn't. They then produced a secret report which was partially redacted, didn't even show it to the councillors until it was actually leaked. And my concern is that one and another where some local people actually published some rather, information which was true in a poster, in a shop, and it was pulled down. Now those are the sort of things that worry me, is not so much at the state level, but at the very local level. And the fact the Horizon programme was so marvellous, which exposed what the hell was going on. And I think that's very, very important to have that sort of investigative journalist, as well as what you were doing.
Oh, I completely agree. But that law change seems like a good thing, no?
Sorry?
The law that was brought in this morning, that's a good thing.
I can't hear you, sorry.
I'm sorry. I was saying it seems like the concern that you have that people cover up wrongness, that's what that law is being brought in to address.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, they're going to prison for 2 years, which seems to be not a very good idea, as 99.9% of the prisons are full. But,
let's hope it has a chilling effect.
Somebody is holding people to be accountable, and that's what was so good about the Horizon programme.
I mean, the flip side of this is the protection for whistleblowers is weak. But we should say something about Ed Snowden now. Janine and I twice together went to see Ed Snowden in Moscow, and I mean, in all probability, he's going to be there for the rest of his life. So he's paid an enormous price for his courage in revealing truths that now are accepted as truths and were necessary things to reveal. And if you look at Chelsea Manning, who was the original source for WikiLeaks, or you see what happened to Julian Assange, or the punitive weight of persecution that these whistleblowers face is a huge discouragement to people in local government or wherever to stepping up, and but the protections aren't there really.
In the particular case I quoted about the notice, the council reported this poster, which was a bit scandalous, but reported it to the police, so that the people who had actually produced this could in fact have been charged. It was the Solicitor General of the council.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about the recent Sucre injunction and what you think that means for the government's approach and interaction with the media?
Which one's the recent one?
About the leaked data around the Afghan the individuals.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. Well, super injunctions are incredibly rare now, but at one point were being handed out like Smarties. When Alan was editor of The Guardian, I was media editor for a bit. We had a media law page in the media section of The Guardian, so I knew a lot of media lawyers because I would be trying to get them to write for me about media law. And I also had a collection of post-it notes that ran all the way around my computer with an alphabetical guide to what all the super injunctions were and who they all referred to. Because all that happens is that every journalist, I'm sorry, this has gone wrong, every journalist comes by the media editor's desk and goes, who is A versus B versus C? You know, oh God, I think, is that the Wolves footballer or is that Elton John? And I just got to the point where it's just easier to write it on post-it notes so that people could just walk past my desk and find it, because everybody in the media knows. After a while, that becomes everybody on who gets the Pop Bitch newsletter knows, or everybody who reads Gawker knows, or everybody on a WhatsApp chain knows. They are incredibly ineffective. The person who takes out the super injunction always ends up being exposed, and in order to get the super injunction, you have to admit it's true. So you've done this terrible double bind thing. And they phased out not because everybody decided it was a terrible suppression of the freedom of the press, but because it became effectively pointless. And it's just the quickest way to embarrass yourself with the exposure of secrets. I mean, the first thing I thought about that one was how very retro. What on earth made you think that it would work better now than it has in the past? Because it tends to attract everyone's notice. But you have a more sophisticated opinion.
Great. I think we're going to wrap it up. And wanted to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. So huge round of applause.